Welcome back. My name is Michael Steinberg. I'm from Brown University, but a devoted fellow traveler of the Center for Transcultural Studies. I'm very pleased to chair this second session, which I'll do in a radically minimalist way, as we've been instructed. This is a session on faith and belief towards a Catholic modernity, and I will introduce speakers one by one. We'll begin with William A. Barbieri from Theology and Religious Studies of the Catholic University in America. William.
All right, well, let me echo my thanks to the organizers here, and especially to Dilip for the invitation. When he asked me if I could talk about a Catholic modernity, I said, well, I'd love to, because I live in hope at the Catholic University of America that one day a Catholic modernity will dawn at my own institution. I have a text to keep me on time. So I'm glad that Dilip elected to call this gathering a symposium, because I think that term strikes the right note. A symposium, after all, is a drinking party or convivial discussion after a banquet. Well, the banquet here has been the nonstop feast of ideas and wisdom that Charles has lavished on his colleagues and wider readership over the many years bringing us up to today. And I have the happy task today of commenting on some of those ideas that Charles has dished up over the past 25 years, beginning with his Marianist lecture at the University of Dayton under the title, A Catholic Modernity? A question he has, incidentally, not yet answered. This lecture and the resulting publication was where Charles outed himself as a committed Catholic to a disbelieving philosophical public by wading into some of the pressing theological questions facing a post-Vatican II church. Of course, to those with eyes to see, the evidence that he was a person of faith had always been discernible between the lines in books like Sources of the Self. As I say, Charles did not provide any sort of pat answer to how Catholicism might successfully come to terms with the conditions of a modern culture that, as he put it, was marked by a closing off to God that negates the gospel, even as it carried facets of Christian life further than they were ever taken or could have been taken within Christendom. He acknowledged that there can never be a total fusion of the faith in any particular society. He gave no answers to how the church might adjust, but he's never been one for pat answers. We all know that. What he did instead was to launch into a penetrating inquiry into the state of religious faith in our day, an inquiry that has generated abundant insights, clues, and nuggets of hope for a constructive future. A first step in that process was to probe deeply into the history and dynamics of secularity, as we just heard. Living in a secular age, also a question, became the topic of his 1999 Gifford Lectures, and ultimately the backbone of a very large book that once again gave no easy answers. A watershed period for this project was Charles's time at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where he formed a troika with two other multifaceted Catholic social theorists, Jose Casanova and Hans Joas. Now, it would have been pretentious to call them a triumvirate and sacrilegious to call them the Trinity, or a saint for that matter. So instead, they became known as the three Catholic tenors, although as far as I know, Jose is the only one who can actually really sing. Together and apart, they've since done brilliant work in analyzing the neuralgic issues that confront religions generally and the Catholic Church in particular. When A Secular Age was published, my late colleague, the philosopher, priest, and global bridge builder George McLean quickly perceived that the book carried a message that was vital for Catholic leaders to hear. And so it came that one evening on the Catholic University campus in DC, Charles squared off to debate the challenges of secularism with the head of the U.S. Catholic Church, Cardinal George of Chicago. Their public exchange was overly polite and as a result didn't really make a lot of headway. Sparks flew, however, at the dinner table afterwards when Charles and Jose cornered the cardinal and offered their criticisms of a church reluctant to minister to the faithful where they lived. There was some banging on the table that evening. That evening was the start of an international research program guided by a framework Charles and Jose devised, identifying 4 principal disjunctions linked to ongoing tensions within the church. Teams of scholars in cities throughout Western and Central Europe, North America, and Asia launched inquiries into one or another of these disjunctions. Easily the most popular subject was the gap between so-called seekers or searchers on the one hand and dwellers or conservers on the other. Within a couple of years, 17 collections of studies had been published, constituting a small library of analyses of patterns of secularization and religious response around the globe. This was only part of the network that Charles has activated through his investigation of the headwinds and dilemmas besetting Catholicism, not to mention the other numerous religious traditions and national settings he's engaged with his partners at the Center for Transcultural Studies, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and other partners. He's made common cause, for example, with his fellow Templeton laureate Thomas Halik, the Czech dissident, psychoanalyst, sociologist, and priest who heads the Christian Academy in Prague and has been coordinating studies of believers and non-believers across Eastern Europe. In short, Charles has inspired a broad-based effort around the world to take stock of the church's situation and to create opportunities for acts of discernment that might illuminate a promising modus vivendi for the community of the faithful. It would be tempting to take up the challenge of evaluating that Marianist lecture from the vantage of a quarter century later, but conveniently, Charles has already done this in a recent essay called A Catholic Modernity 25 Years On. And if anybody wants to look at that essay, we have that in our recent publication, The Faith and Beliefs of Non-Believers. In this piece, he revisits and complexifies a thought experiment from the original essay involving how Matteo Ricci might evangelize our own modern culture and era. Also, in familiar Taylorian fashion, he distinguishes between disenchantment 1 and disenchantment 2, and unbundling 1 and unbundling 2. And he shows how we have to look through 3 or perhaps 4, depending on how you count, lenses in order to form solid judgments about how to respond to changes in our religious situation. But I'll spare you those details and simply highlight what I find to be 2 significant and compelling developments in his outlook. First, as many of you will have noticed, a recent theme in Charles's work is a growing meditation on the question of moral progress. This is one of the impetuses behind Degenerations of Democracy, one of his other recent books, and it receives a chapter called History of Ethical Growth in the new book, Cosmic Connections. In the recent essay I mentioned, Charles theologizes this question. He asks, for example, how does the kingdom of God build in history and beyond? And he asserts that, quote, the history of religion shows progress, or what we might call a growth in moral insight. In explicating this claim, he looks backwards and forwards. Backwards to the axial age, which, he suggests, can be understood theologically as a major step in a process in which, quote, humans are being led, educated, brought to some higher outlook by some, in parentheses, question mark, agency. We struggle in our shared human milieu to educate and unfold our moral sensibilities and to live up to them. But in the Christian outlook, we are aided by the communion of saints, in which Charles was recently inducted, I hear, and transformed by the kenotic love of God expressed in the Incarnation. Now, looking forwards, Charles invokes the Vatican II formula of scrutinizing the signs of the times and interpreting them in light of the gospel, in order to characterize the need for Christians to discern when opportunities arise to push the envelope by risking a more thoroughgoing commitment to the emulation of Christ, imitatio Christi. Understanding the ins and outs of moral change is just the type of thorny issue on which we could really use Charles's insight. And frankly, the Catholic Church has much more work to do in developing its own particular account of the signs of the times and the hermeneutics of religious change. That's one of the topics my center is working on now. Second, and finally, he asks this question in his essay: how, in the wreckage left by the collapse of Christendom, can the gospel still be heard and work today? His answer is to invoke the parable of the mustard seed and to envision a succession of individual acts of faith that break the ordinary course of things, as he puts it, and slowly contribute to a growing rhizomatic network of seeds that, often unbeknownst to us, sustains us in our efforts to transform the world for the better. The Catholic modern, he concludes, is called to practice the ecumenism of friendship, not only across the divides within Catholicism today, but with other Christians, believers from other traditions, and indeed seekers of all sorts. I leave you with this image, the ecumenism of friendship, that Charles provides of peace, fellowship, and mutual exchange, because that, after all, is the spirit in which he draws us together today in the convivial discussion of our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you. And our second speaker is Daniel Cere of Religious Studies here at McGill.
Thank you. I'd like to share something a little different, Dilibas, to share a few personal vignettes and a few anecdotes that I can share are not related so much to the impact on my thinking, but on my life. In my 20s, I entered into the doctoral program in political science at McGill and wrote an essay for a grad seminar that Charles was offering. It was quite a critical reading of strands of German Romanticism that fed into forms of racial nationalism. Charles invited me to meet with him to discuss the paper. Needless to say, I was nervous, expecting blowback, perhaps a dismal grade. However, your response to the paper was enthusiastic. You gave me an A+, one of the grades I treasure. It was clear that you had no interest in contributing to any what you call the modern liberal cover-up of the darker dimensions of modernity, including your beloved tradition of Romanticism. But in that meeting, you also detected my growing interest in the intersections of religion and politics, and warned me that the political science department at that time would likely not be receptive to dissertation projects that I might suggest. So you suggested I consider completely revamping my intellectual journey, abandoning political science, and completing my doctoral work in religious studies. You even suggested a possible supervisor doing some interesting work in political theology. That was the first time I heard that term. It was a 5 to 10 minute exchange. You probably don't recall it, but I took it to heart. Within a few months, I withdrew from the doctoral program, found my way to a PhD program in religious studies under the very supervisor that you recommended, and began that winding path that eventually brought me back to McGill in the School of Religious Studies, teaching about religion and politics. A second anecdote. I'm from a downscale working class family, but like Charles, a religiously mixed family. My mom was Protestant, my dad non-practicing Catholic. But though I was baptized Catholic, I had lost any connection with religious affiliation. Now, I heard rumors that you might be a Catholic, but I didn't see any of that, any evidence of that in the work that I was familiar with. However, while I was a grad student, I met someone, a devout Catholic woman with a West Indian Portuguese background, and it was pretty evident that I wished to pursue this relationship. It was going to have to be a Catholic marriage. And that prompted me to make some effort to reconnect with my Catholic roots. And so, since the sacrament of confession is the normal place to start this rebooting, one day during Lent, I headed down to a church, joined the line of penitents for confession. However, as I kind of moved to the front of the line, misgivings started to surface. I began to feel all kinds of internal tensions, conflicts between the unknowns of faith and my comfortable, a-religious intellectual journey. That confusion grew, and I was about to bolt from the confessional line when I happened to notice somebody struggling to extricate their lanky frame from the confines of one of the confessional boxes. It was Charles Margrave Taylor. And that image, I can still see it now. It's like a kind of shock and revelation, a kind of icon of two worlds colliding and commingling. I ended up in the confessional. My evolving journey in faith and my intellectual journey, as well as my nuptial journey, continue to this day. It gets even stranger. About 11 months ago, I was dealing with some mounting medical issues, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, persistent issues with digestion. My doctor warned me that I was facing either a heart attack or stroke if things didn't change. Started piling me up with medication. The day after I got this verdict, I bumped into Charles at the bottom of Peel Street. He was heading home. As he was effortlessly bounding up the steep street, I had to beg you to slow down, worried that the doctor's prognosis would be realized sooner rather than later. And he said, sorry, Dan, I've been doing fast walking to keep up the cardio, use it or lose it. It was another one of those moments. 92-year-old, in the words of Psalm 92, fresh and green, still bearing fruit even in old age, and still making significant adjustments to improve your health and vitality. That night, I began to make some immediate changes to my lifestyle. I didn't research any diet, Google any exercise program, just ran with the inspiration from Charles. Went back to the doctor 5 months later, considerable weight loss, blood pressure, cholesterol down, digestive issues cleared up, getting high fives from the doctor and the nurses. And another sweet thing about this is that I didn't have to plow through a 600-page tome by Taylor on modern narratives of embodied subjectivity and health to get that inspiration. Colleagues have asked me, how did you do it? What can I say? Take a walk with Charles. These Taylor-provoked inspirations and transformations to my intellectual and spiritual journey, including upgrades to my physical health, just some of the moments of grace in walking with Charles. Just a few words on the actual topic. Taylor and a Catholic modernity. During his 2012 visit to Canada, Pope Francis referred to Charles as one of the great scholars of our time. The Pope reiterated Taylor's view that secularization should be responded to not as a threat, but as a challenge to our spiritual imagination. He cited a passage from Secular Age that this world is, quote, an occasion for recompositions of spiritual life in new forms and for new ways of existing, both in and out of relationship to God. Building on Taylor, Francis spoke of the need for a new passion in the quest for new languages and new forms of expression. When we look at the impressive sweep of Taylor's corpus of work and its import for faith, it's tempting to position it in the broad framework of powerful European intellectual and religious traditions. But I would like to touch briefly on more local context of his contribution and their curious roots within the Canadian religious landscape. You might want to get to know that landscape after Tuesday. 3 quick points. First, Taylor has always shown appreciation for the lived religion of ordinary believers. One example has been his interest in popular spiritual movements, such as the 17th century French school of spirituality. He celebrates the contributions of people like St. Francis de Sales, Fenelon, Marie de l'Incarnation, in promoting forms of personal and mystical piety accessible to all believers, ordinary laity as well as religious. This movement also inspired waves of devout laity, both men and women, to dedicate their lives to various forms of apostolic service and outreach. One of those missionary initiatives led to the foundation of Montreal. In the 1640s, a devout group of artisans, agricultural workers, guided by lay leaders such as Paul de Maisonneuve and Jean Mans, established the Montreal Mission. Rare for its times, the founding document of Montreal stressed the key role of the laity, including women, in apostolic work. The early settlers also embraced a social mission to aid and uplift the vulnerable. St. Vincent de Paul once wrote, "The poor suffer less from a lack of generosity than a lack of organization." Shortly after the establishment of the community, Jean Mans founded Montreal's first hospital, Hotel Dieu. Margaret Bourgeois laid the foundations for educational institutions on the island focused on women. In a lecture a few years ago on Catholic Modernity Revisited over at the Newman Center, I recall Taylor lamenting the fact that this rich and innovative tradition of spirituality seemed to be repressed to the point of extinction due to the growing dominance of more clericalized forms of faith. In one sense, I beg to differ and point to one piece of counter evidence yourself. Namely, one of the better known faces of Canadian Catholicism today draws from that well. And curiously, the Pope's strange new encyclical, Delixic Nos, is reconnecting again with that tradition. A second Canadian piece to the Taylor religious puzzle: when I entered grad school, my dear mother gave me a gift. Pattern of Politics. A beaten up copy of Taylor's 1970 book, Pattern of Politics. The gift came out a directive to make sure I took courses from this man. She never went near to a university, but was reading Taylor before I was. She was deeply embedded in the social gospel tradition of the United Church of Canada, and she recognized a kindred spirit. When Charles studied at McGill in the 1950s, he came into direct contact with social gospel through his involvement with SCM, the Student Christian Movement, and one of the important vehicles for social gospel during the first part of the 20th century in Canada. Distinguished McGill profs in SCM included Eugene Forsey, R.B.Y. Scott, William Cantwell Smith, two of them from the School of Religious Studies, by the way. Canadian social gospel movements changed the face of Canadian Protestantism during the first half of the 20th century, fed into the formation of a major social democratic political party, the NDP, which Taylor has been committed to in his life. And Taylor's life, I think, connects to and continues to nurture this tradition of Christian social democratic humanism to this day. The third piece: Taylor's work connects to another overlooked dimension of Canadian Catholicism. In Avenues of Faith, Taylor notes two distinct Catholic responses to modernity in the modern era: a clericalist response of resistance and a lay response of creative engagement. Canada gave birth to an important variant of this tradition of lay Catholic liberalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Figures like Wilfrid Laurier, Henry Bourassa advanced a, quote, political liberalism that was religion-friendly and dedicated to the defense of diversity and minority rights. Despite clerical resistance, it proved to be profoundly attractive to lay Catholics and shaped their voting patterns over the course of the 20th century, anchoring electoral successes for the Liberal parties, both at the federal and provincial levels. It also fed into Quebec's quiet revolution. Charles had made major contributions to the ongoing vitality of this movement. In his 1960 essay entitled Clericalism, Taylor underscored the key role of faithful lay engagement. The Church, he wrote, must, through its lay members, penetrate secular life, not as an act of planned policy, but as water permeates porous rock. In this way, even though they will be full of nascent contradictions and constantly subject to review, there can be a number of ways and styles of life where one is fully human and fully Christian, at one and the same time. But this effort requires a laity conscious of its role. John Henry Newman, another fellow traveler for me, is noted for his vision of the critical role of the laity in the church in the modern world. In many ways, Charles has been contributing to this mission of equipping the laity not just to exist in the world, but to spiritually inhabit it. To a large extent, his mission has been worked out within the setting of the university. But it was none other than Newman himself who underscored the unique role of the university in equipping lay men and women for their life of faith within the world. A university, Newman wrote, is a direct preparation for this world. It's not a convent. It's not a seminary. It's a place to fit men and women of the world for the world. And we cannot possibly keep them from plunging into the world with all its ways, principles, maxims, but we can prepare them. And it's not the way to learn to swim in troubled waters, never to have gone into them. Taylor's life and work, I think, speaks to Newman's vision in spades. Taylor's evolving contributions have rightfully received acclaim from a wide array of academic fields, but arguably his work has been marked by vital contributions to the life of faith and spirituality. My dear friend Jose Casanova spoke of Taylor as a living saint, but Jose, I beg to differ here. Canadians, I must confess, are a bit nervous about such claims. We had a prominent figure, once widely acclaimed as a living saint. That hasn't worked out too well. Nor would I believe would Charles ever invite such a recognition. I think he's unfailingly offered himself simply as a fellow traveler, struggling with the rest of us through the turbulent world of modernity. In today's world, rather than succumbing to enticements to place our lives in the hands of some spiritual master, in my experience, we're far safer and far more richly sustained walking the walk with such fellow travelers. Thank you, Charles.
Our third speaker is Lindsay Waters, Executive Editor for the Humanities, Harvard University Press, Emeritus.
It's so great to be here and to be celebrating Charles. And I hope I make it through my talk. Okay. Charles Taylor has contributed, am I speaking to the right place? Is this working? Okay. Has contributed rightly, and I'm going to have to take off my glasses in order to see, has contributed mightily, not nightly, mightily to political theory, philosophy, the history of ideas, and Catholic thought. And his writings are of great consequence to literary studies as well, especially his new book, Cosmic Connections, Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment. So happy to see all that treatment of poetry in there, Charles. This is wonderful. Taylor takes us from Helden, Novalis, Keats, and Shelley on to Gerard Manley Hopkins, Baudelaire, and Mallarmé, and wonderfully to Miłosz. He argues we need a relation to the word. Underline that. We need a relation to the word, to the universe, to things, and to nature. All these we see beautifully around us here in Quebec. We're really lucked out with the weather, haven't we? His work is filled with love and asks us to let ourselves be carried away by poetry to feel connected to life. First of all, open yourself to Montreal and to Quebec when it is fall. I love Canada in the autumn. Charles Taylor captures the feelings of Catholic modernism. Catholic modernism may sound to some like a contradiction in terms. Maybe it sounds like Canada itself. How can Canada mix English, French, and Inuit all together? If Catholic modernism seems to you a demanding subject, pulling you in different directions, both to Catholicism and modernism, think of how Quebec invites you to enjoy life in the poetries of French, English, and Inuit. Read that book. It will give you many chances. Be flexible, be limber, and imagine yourself hiking or even better, skiing in the Laurentian Mountains in the fresh snow. The snow's coming, but it's not here. We can enjoy not having the snow right now. Even better, skiing in the Laurentian Mountains in fresh snow behind lanky, long-legged Charles Taylor. One thing to say about Charles Taylor is, as you've noticed, he is tall, and he is a big picture person. That means he is a sort of like a Cecil B. DeMille of philosophy, because he is willing to draw a really big picture where most people in philosophy and most people in the academic world or the entire world are so cautious, so scared of everything that all they are willing to do is to pare their fingernails. Charles turned away from small bore shooting like his friend RAF pilot Bernard Williams to get the big picture into view. It was Bernard who connected me to Charles, and it's great to recall Bernard now. He connected me to Charles years ago in hopes I would consider publishing this huge manuscript called Sources of the Self, which another publisher had thought was a little bit too big. Can you believe anybody thinks these books are too big? They're just perfect. But so it was Bernard who would always train his eyes on the proximate too, and he searched the horizon and so focused on the emerging big picture. Both Charles and Bernard loved philosophy, but not the kind that confined itself to minute matters. I remember how at the annual meetings of the American Philosophical Association, I used to attend that meeting at least twice a year to hawk my wares as a publisher. First for the University of Minnesota Press, and later for the Harvard University Press. And when I would go to those meetings, and I'd be showing my books, including Charles's books, the lemmings who attended those meetings used to pick up earlier books of Charles we had on display and poke fun at Charles by saying at him, "He is a big picture person, isn't he?" As if such a snide comment would put the already formidable Charles Taylor in his place, and that good things. And that would do the trick of containing the magic they might feel emanating from his books, and that worked until he was given at Templeton. Inside, it made me appreciate the good that a prize can do. I mean, it might have been good to have the money, but something about the Templeton. It was a good thing, and it did cause other people to pause from saying their sort of condemnatory, foolish comments. From the beginning of his career, Charles was suspicious of the behaviorism and scientific approaches to the world that dominated much of the academic and scientific world, because they scared people from inquiring into things that might trouble their picture of things. People generally promote bitsiness. Bitsiness is how I describe that's the opposite of what Charles was about. People generally promote bitsiness because whenever we call that bitsiness. I call that bitsiness as usual. It really works for many people, but you don't want it, because when you break things into small enough bits, most people are afraid of making judgments about anything and everything. It puts a hex on the good that Kant did with his critique of judgment. We want the critique of judgment to be part of our life. And of course, alas, the great desire of most humans is to escape responsibility. Now, if you have noticed that a jot of moral concern or fear has entered into the tone of my voice, that's not a mistake on your part. I feel very close to Charles, and I also feel it is part of what he is doing to challenge us. His work is both an intellectual analysis and an effort to change the world. Who is it who said? Somebody said something about how the philosophy up until this point has been about understanding the world, but philosophy from now on should be about changing the world. I heard that someplace. Small picture people advocate a small picture world. Someone who is quite useful to Taylor is Heidegger, and Heidegger has an essay a famous essay called The Age of the World Picture, in which he says, you know, one of the things we really need to avoid is making big pictures. But Taylor rejects this, and he obviously makes big pictures. And not just big books, it's big pictures. Taylor is not only a big picture person, he is also obviously a Hegelian. As a Hegelian, he believes in the course of history, and he believes there are transformations taking place in the course of history. Well, we're aware of that. Taylor is committed to understanding how things historically developed. In the United States, we often try to escape from history. We have a popular song that talks about that we don't know much about history. It also says we don't know much about the French we took, which is a bit of a problem here in Quebec for a visitor. And anyway, Taylor's notion of history is a commitment to an evolutionary notion of change. Taylor had said that there are lots of things about the earlier views coming from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that we have lost, but that he wishes we could have access to. But he is not looking to return to the Middle Ages, and he does not believe in a return to Narnia as possible. He believes in the future. The dawn is red, maple leaf red. As you know. Well, the maple leaves are mostly fallen, haven't they? Taylor, with his big picture perspective and historical sense, gives us an alternative way to think about Catholicism and to think of Catholic modernism. We do need a sense, a picture of the good life as it might be led within the modern philosophical and Catholic dispensation, and we have one. Modern writers have unfortunately tended to cover over the ideas of the human good that are the very basis for many philosophical investigations of subjectivity that do exist, as well as for other epistemological inquiries. Charles Taylor goes back. His work presents a chronological account of the resources he says are ready to hand if we only appreciated them. He has offered a narrative of modern philosophy from Augustine to Foucault. His effort to uncover the moral resources leads to a novel interpretations of most of the central figures and movements of the modern tradition. He argues that the modern turn inward did indeed result in the demise of substantive conceptions of reason that we found in the Greeks. And he goes on to show that the inward turn is not disastrous, but is in fact the result of our efforts to reach the good as we have haltingly, but nonetheless steadily sought to define it over the last number of centuries. At the heart of this definition, Charles finds what he calls the affirmation of ordinary life. This is the most moving and compelling and potentially winning part of the large story he has set before us, before our eyes in his works. The inward turn took the form of an affirmation, a privileging of the ordinary, of the value of ordinary life, family, work, etc. In short, Taylor's important insight here is that modern subjectivity in all its epistemological, aesthetic, and its Catholic forms has roots in ideas of human good. And I wish us all well.
Can I move it up, Paul?
Thanks, Lindsay, and to all three of you. We do have 10 to 15 minutes for interventions, comments, and questions. My understanding is this is a hybrid informal event. It's both academic and personal, so nobody should be shy to contribute on any of those dimensions. While you're getting ready, any comments about each other from the...
I don't know if it's a stand-up kind of comment, but I'm just struck by the thought that, Charles, after listening to my colleagues, maybe you've missed your calling. When I hear these images of you skiing and running around the streets of Montreal, you could have at least been a fitness guru, but maybe a real, spiritual master and guru doing the martial arts as well. So, combining a healthy mind and a healthy body, right?
The next one.
There we go.
I'm here, Paolo Costa here. Well, thank you. It's just there is an aspect. Of course, there is this significant element of the big picture. Yeah. And then there is the humility. Yeah. And you have both of them. And I think we are, yeah, this is appealing for a lot of us, is the idea that you need the big picture in order to begin to understand, not to have the last word. And that's a trick. It's a very interesting, it's so specific, so special about Charles. The idea that you can have both the big picture and humbleness. That seems to me to be very important.